Why are hikers experiencing and encountering strange things they cannot explain in the Appalachians? Take Brandon, for example, a 55-year-old man who encountered what he believed to be something that wasn't human. But before we get into today's video, be sure to go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button because I release storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural. Let's go. Brandon is a 55-year-old male who spent his younger years hiking the Appalachian Trail. He has hiked most of the trails in Pennsylvania and New York. He is a native of the area and has been hiking well since he was around 12. He has seen many strange things while walking in the woods, but was left with goosebumps on this specific hike. He was hiking a trail and had just crossed a bridge over Yellow Creek in Pennsylvania. On the other side of the bridge, he noticed a large yellow striped maple tree with a huge limb that came out at about a 90-degree angle. There was also a small green tent with a sleeping bag and backpack underneath it. The camping equipment was torn up and scattered on the ground. He figured it was a hiker who had made camp for the night and went further up the trail. He had hiked this section of the trail many times and was pretty familiar with the kinds of animals that inhabit these woods. He also knew that if a bear had taken up residence in this area, they would tear up your camp and carry off with your food and other items. He also knew that if a bear has been in this area, it would have scratched trees to mark its territory. He saw no markings of any kind on the tree near the camp, and he was camping in the exact location a week later and smelt this awful stench lingering throughout. It was a smell he could not put words to. It was the worst odor he had ever encountered in these woods. He didn't see any animal tracks, but heard something walking. It was a parched summer, so he knew it wasn't a deer, judging by the animal's weight. Brandon describes himself as a lifelong hunter and has spent the majority of his life in these same woods. He knows what a deer, elk, or bear sounds like when they walk through the leaves. But this was something very large and heavy. Brandon is 6'5", and this thing sounded much bigger than him. He heard the sound of this animal for about 5 minutes, and he began to notice that when he stopped moving, the sounds would stop too. Then he moved a few feet and it did the same. He stopped again, and so did this animal. He was not one to run away from any animal, and even though he was carrying a .22 caliber rifle and a knife, this time he was scared. The smell was so intense that he could taste it. He hated to say it and it sounded cliche, but he got the distinct feeling that he was being hunted. He packed up his camp and decided to hike further up the trail another 5 miles to camp for the night. He set up his tent and had a fire going. The feeling that he was being hunted was still with him. He could hear something a lot bigger than a bear circling his camp. He had read some stories that mentioned a whooping sound and had heard that same noise before. It was reminiscent of a giant person running through the brush. These sounds were heavy and slow. He turned and saw a large black shape moving out of the shadows towards him. He knew it wasn't a bear because this thing moved as if it was on 2 legs. He shot pepper spray at it, which did not affect whatever this was. It just kept coming towards him, and he could hear it making these whooping sounds. He never saw its face because of how dark it was, and he didn't have enough light to illuminate it. But he's convinced that whatever it was easily standing up to look into his camp. He was so scared that he lit a road flare and threw it at this thing. It just turned and lumbered away quickly, making heavy sounds as it went. Now, whatever this thing was, it must have weighed easily over 400 pounds. He saw no footprints, but the ground was too dry to leave one anyway. His dad was a farmer in this area many years ago and always claimed that Sasquatch were real. He had told his own stories to tell, but Brandon had never taken him too seriously. After this, Brandon is a believer of these encounters. Now, the Appalachian Trail is a 2,193-mile trail that cuts through the heart of 14 states along the eastern United States, starting in northern Georgia, ending in Maine, and taking anywhere from 5 to 8 months to hike through. Ground broke for the Appalachian Trail in 1921 and was completed in 1937. According to statistics, more than 3 million people hike a portion of the trail each year, with around 500 hikers completing the world's longest hiking trail. The changes in elevation through the trip have been equated to climbing Mount Everest 16 times and has been called the most dangerous hiking trail in the world. There have been 13 reported murders on the Appalachian Trail since 1974, with no murderer ever caught, making some of the disappearances and murders unsolved to this very day. Each year, there are reported injuries from minor to serious, including broken bones, falls, animal encounters, and human-on-human assaults. The trail is rated relatively safe, but precautions are still needed. Also, reported are missing people and fatalities. These are minimal, but they still happened. Gary Largay, 66-year-old retired Air Force nurse. Gary was an admitted nature lover. She moved from her home she shared with her husband to Florida to Tennessee in order to take hiking classes and be closer to the trail. She had assured family members that she could take the trail herself, and despite the warnings from her loved ones and known dangers, Largay was adamant that she would conquer the Appalachian Trail. Gary, as she was known to friends and family, set out on her own adventure near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia on April 23, 2013, with friend Jane Lee so that she would not be hiking alone. The plan was to hike from the middle of the Appalachian Trail north to Mount Katahdin in Maine, then take a ferry back to the starting point and finish the southern portion of the trail last, hiking into northern Georgia. Largay's husband would periodically meet the women to restock supplies, as Gary could not carry a heavy pack due to an old back injury. June would mark the very first problems with the hike when Jane had to leave due to a family emergency. Lee would later reveal that Gary had problems keeping pace with Lee and could not properly use a compass. By July, Largay had hiked over 900 miles, leaving only 200 left to reach Mount Katahdin. This portion of the trail is notoriously strenuous and treacherous, and the vegetation is thick. Gary stepped off the main path for a moment for a bathroom break, but by the time she had finished, she found herself lost. At this point, she tried messaging her husband and asking for help, but she had no cell signal. The text never went through, unbeknownst to her. A storm had hit the area, and Largay was hiking the night before. Contact was lost. So when her husband hadn't heard from her on the first day, he wasn't alarmed. But by day 2, he knew there was a problem and contacted authorities. Aerial and canine searches were conducted along with interviews with other area hikers for tips they may have had, but nothing was ever found. Gary Largay spent 26 days trying to find her way out and documenting her plight in a journal. On the 26th day, 66-year-old Gary Largay passed away from what coroners would eventually determine was exposure. 2 full years after Largay went missing, a hiker contacted authorities and reporting having found a dilapidated tent with human remains inside. Police Lieutenant Kevin Adam received word about the discovery and knew there were a few possibilities of what the hiker had found, one being Gary Largay. After having been missing for 2 years, Largay was found in an orange tent with a few personal effects, including her journal, which was updated to the day she presumably passed away. Her last wish was for her husband and daughter to be able to read her final words. When authorities reached the area, there was substantial evidence that Largay had tried to draw her attention to her site by starting a fire. There were charred trees where she had presumably tried to set a fire, but because of the damp atmosphere, it would have been hard to get it going. There was also a clearing near where she was found that if she had known about it, aerial searches conducted in the area would have been possibly successful. Gary Largay was just 2 miles off the Appalachian Trail where her remains were found. The family thanked authorities for their continued hard work and dedication in the case and asked the public for privacy as they grieved their loss. This next story was submitted by Floyd, a park ranger who worked in Bear Mountain and encountered the strange and supernatural. Floyd patrolled the Bear Mountain portion of the Appalachian Trail in Harriman State Park, specifically the stretch from Nye Ridge to Bear Mountain shelters. It was between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. He was on patrol specifically to watch for bear activity, since they had several bear sightings in that same area that week. He was driving a hike and patrol vehicle specifically designed to have high visibility at night. He carried a headlamp, a flashlight, bear repellent, and first aid kits as part of his equipment. He was talking on the radio with another park ranger doing a patrol in the Palisades area. The other ranger told him that he saw something flying over the road and that flew out of sight in his direction. He said, "I think I just saw a flying man," with Floyd responding, "What?" That's when Floyd saw what the other man had seen. A creature, a humanoid in shape, flying over the Appalachian Trail from the direction of Bear Mountain. It was flying very low, below the level of the tree line, and it was flying in a southeasterly direction. Floyd radioed back immediately to the other ranger and said, "I now see it." At first, they suspected that it had to have been a person who had jumped off the mountain using a paraglider to fly over the road. But his next thought was that they had some sort of unidentified flying object in the area. He stopped the patrol vehicle. Floyd watched this thing as it flew very low, below the level of the tree line in the covered Bear Mountain shelter area. He saw that it had wings, clearly, and the wings were bat-like in shape. They appeared to almost be feathered or leathery, and it had the body of a man. The head appeared pointed and downward, looking at the trail, and he could now make out that it had two large glowing eyes in the dark. He saw the shoulders and arms, which were also muscular yet hairy. The arms were clearly wings. They had some sort of appendage that allowed the creature to fly. He saw long, extended fingers similar to a human's, but exaggerated. They were clawed, and the legs were also clearly defined. Now, he watched this creature for approximately 15 seconds in complete shock. It flew from the direction of Bear Mountain to the direction of the covered shelter, a distance of roughly half a mile. Floyd then turned on the high beams of his patrol vehicle and shined them in the creature's direction. It then turned its head in response, looking in Floyd's direction, allowing Floyd to see its face's profile. It then banked to the right, and he saw its body profile in full as it flew over the covered shelter. He then lost sight of it as it flew in the direction of Nye Ridge. It was then gone from view in less than 5 seconds. The creature was flying very low in the area of the covered shelter, and he believed it landed in the vicinity. He then drove towards the covered shelter to try and see it. He gets out of his vehicle, looks around, and even though he was afraid it might attack him if it had found him, but he didn't see anything. He admits feeling very vulnerable in the area after this encounter. He drove out of the area as quickly as possible, returning to headquarters. He never saw it again after that night. It was a fascinating encounter. He knows that he is not supposed to talk about this, but he is very curious about what it is that he saw. It wasn't a man flying nor a man with wings. Floyd believes it was some sort of unidentified flying creature. He doesn't know why he saw it, but he knows that he saw it. It's changed his perspective on things and made him question reality. Michael Kaiser. On Saturday, October 12th, 2019, 56-year-old expert adventure hiker Michael William Kaiser made his last known phone call to his brother before going missing in the Bear Rocks area of Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. Kaiser entered on the Appalachian Trail on October 11th, 2019, near an area known as Bake of a Knob in Lee County Township to do some hiking. The expert hiker was very familiar with the area and had told family members where he would be, even stopping to send his brother a picture of the area where he was that very day. By the next day, no one had heard from Kaiser, prompting his brother to contact authorities to report Kaiser missing. A search party assembled in hopes they would be able to locate the missing man, but initially found nothing. On October 16th, 2019, police discovered a Ford F-150 in the area's parking lot where family members told them their relative had started. The truck was determined to be that of Michael Kaiser, but he was nowhere to be found. Family members joined the search teams in the last known area where Kaiser said he was, and where teams searched for days. Then, on Thursday, October 17, 2019, an unnamed family member saw what looked to be a body at the bottom of a rocky embankment. Police later identified the remains as those of missing hiker Michael Kaiser. It is unknown if he had slipped and fell, or if there was a rock slide, or if he had some sort of medical event. The family thanked the police, search and rescue teams, and the community for their continued support and help searching for their loved one. There were no plans to close the trail as the death was deemed accidental, and there was no threat to the public comment by police. Jesse Albertine Hoover. In May of 1983, 54-year-old Texas native Jesse Albertine Hoover set out as a solo hike on the Appalachian Trail as a through hiker from Maine to Georgia. Hoover had read about the famous trail in a National Geographic article, and after her husband was killed in a car accident in '82, she decided to try the hike alone. Making her way from White Settlement, Texas, Hoover chose to start the hike from Maine, which is the most treacherous part of the trail. Before leaving Texas, Jesse made several plans and an itinerary for the ill-fated trip, informing family of secluded stops for supplies and money along the way. She also contacted her physician, making plans for the epilepsy medication she would need refilled while she was gone. Against her family's wishes that she not go, Hoover had assured them that she would be fine and the trail was perfectly safe for a woman of her age. When Jesse arrived at the starting point in Maine, she would have been met with a sign from the Forestry Service warning hikers that the section of trail referred to as the 100-mile wilderness was dangerous and without services. The sign says, "Appalachian Trail Caution. There are no places to obtain supplies or get help until Able Bridge, 100 miles north. Do not attempt this section unless you have a minimum of 10-day supplies and are fully equipped." This is the longest wilderness section of the entire AT, and its difficulty should not be underestimated. Good hiking. This wouldn't have been a rare decision because as many as 10% of hikers start their very journey in Maine to get the most difficult section over with in the beginning, rather than wait until they are exhausted at the end of their hike. Also, aside from the terrain, elevation and weather that can impede hikers is the weight of their supply pack's weight. 8 to 10 days of water, food, first aid, personal shelter, and clothing can weigh up to 35 or 50 pounds. That's the equivalent of strapping a kindergartner to your back and hiking up in elevation for 100 miles. Hoover started her hike on May 16, 1983, south of Baxter State Park. After her family hadn't heard from her in almost 2 months, her sister called and reported her missing to the Warden's Service on July 11, 1983. This is when officials learned that Hoover was sorely unprepared for the adventure, having only beef jerky for food and light clothing. A search was initiated using her itinerary and talking to area hikers and a ranger that had advised the entire search team that Hoover tried to climb Mount Katahdin on May 20th, 1983, but didn't have the proper equipment, and therefore was advised to not push forward. This is the same area where 30 years later, Gary Largay would also perish while trying to negotiate the Appalachian Trail. Searchers and law enforcement descended on the area, continuing to ask anyone if they had seen Hoover. A maintenance worker for the Able Gatehouse on Golden Road, a passageway built in the early 1970s for access to the now defunct Great Northern Paper Company, stated that he had seen a woman fitting Jesse Hoover's description in late May walking towards the 100-mile wilderness trailhead. This was the last confirmed sighting of the missing hiker. The search area was hundreds of miles of trails that aren't well marked and over 15 million acres of thick, dense forest. A daunting task at best. In the over 2,200 miles of the Appalachian Trail, this is the worst area for a hiker to become lost. Authorities and search teams spent the remainder of the summer asking hikers if they had seen Hoover, to keep an eye out for anything that was out of place that may lead them to her whereabouts. and searching for her themselves, but to no avail. Another unnamed hiker went missing in the same area around the same time as Hoover. Search and rescue teams and police had kept a lookout for Hoover's blue backpack, clothing, gear, or anything that had belonged to her. The other hiker was found alive, however. Jesse Hoover was never heard from nor seen again. Theories of what happened to Hoover vary, but the most popular opinions are that she became lost and either succumbed to the elements and/or starvation, or had a medical event from her epilepsy and perished due to that. Jessie Hoover was a widow looking to broaden her horizons and get one with nature. She had never hiked such a long distance and was easily ill-prepared to tackle the most challenging part of the Appalachian Trail alone. Even seasoned hikers advise against solo hiking the trail due to its dangers and potential disorientation. Weather often changes quickly in the area and can still be in the 30s to 40s for the low in May. Hikers are advised to take hiking and outdoor skill classes before attempting the world's longest hiking trail. Even then, hiking solo is a bad idea and should never be attempted. Geoff Haigh. On February 9th, 1970, 16-year-old Geoff Haigh was hiking in the Great Smokies National Park with his Eagle Scout Troop 95. Along with 2 other scouts and 3 troop leaders. The hike had begun in Tennessee, and they were to spend the night in North Carolina near the Appalachian Trail and return the following day. On their return trip, all was going well except for one of these scouts was lagging a few minutes behind the others. Haigh sat down at the trail fork for a break and some water. When the group started out on the trail again, Haigh asked if he could stay behind and wait for the other scout. Agreeing to let him as they were close to their destination anyway, the group leader and 3 others headed on down the trail to the parking lot less than 30 minutes away. That was the last time that Geoff Haigh was ever seen alive. His disappearance was immediately reported and a search began. For 10 days, search and rescue teams joined law enforcement as well as game warden services to search for the Eagle Scout. On day 10, 16-year-old Geoff Haigh was found, frozen, missing a shoe and his pants around his ankles. This was attributed to a condition called paradoxical undressing and happens when late stages of hypothermia set in. The person will feel as though they are too hot, thus removing their clothing. This makes a bad situation worse. Removing clothing aids hypothermia, cooling the core temperature much quicker. His pack was found about 1,000 feet away with the contents scattered and the pack itself in the middle of the river on a rock. This case was compared to a similar case in California where a Boy Scout went missing when he fell behind the rest of the scouts. On July 19th, 1991, 12-year-old Jared Negretti was on his first backpacking trip with his Boy Scout troop where they were summiting Mount San Gorgonio in San Bernardino National Forest. Coincidentally, San Bernardino National Forest is the start of the Pacific Coast Trail on the West Coast, opposite of the Appalachian Trail, but quite a bit shorter than the AT. A search for Negretti turned up a camera with a haunting last picture of this boy, with a few candy wrappers. The Boy Scout was never found despite some of the largest searches ever conducted on the National Forest grounds. These 2 cases are very similar, with one being found deceased and the other never being found again. Authorities and trail experts tell hikers to never hike these trails alone. Last, we have Scott Lilly. On Friday, August 12, 2011, a group of hikers on the Appalachian Trail at Cow Camp Gap Shelter in George Washington Jefferson National Forest found the body of 30-year-old Scott Lilly of South Bend, Indiana. Lilly had started his hike in Virginia on June 15, 2011, as he was a Civil War buff and wanted to camp in the area to do some exploring. He had taken the trail name of Stonewall, some speculate as a reference to Andrew Stonewall Jackson, who died as a result of friendly fire in 1863. The last time anyone heard from Lilly was on July 31st, 2011, when he had climbed the Priest in Nelson County, Virginia. He planned to hitch a ride the next day and re-up on his supplies in a nearby town. However, he never made it, and no one had heard from him again. 12 days after, Scott Lilly's remains were found in a shallow grave near the shelter. An autopsy would reveal that Lilly had perished due to asphyxia by suffocation, making the manner of death a homicide. In interviews conducted by authorities, it was said that Lilly had a backpack, new Ozark hiking shoes, and an Appalachian Trail handbook and a Nintendo game system that were never found. Police gave no motive as to why they think Scott Lilly was murdered. At the time of Lilly's murder, there were several other homicide investigations, including the 1996 killing of the 2 women in Shenandoah National Park and several other death investigations in George Washington Jackson Park. Despite the best efforts of police, the Scott Lilly homicide remains unsolved, as well as the Williams-Winnan case. Is it possible that all these missing person cases on the Appalachian Trail are somehow related? Could there be a connection between the disappearances of Geoff and Jared Negretti? Was he murdered, and if so, why? And are the park rangers who've experienced things like the above really telling the truth? But more importantly, I want to know what you guys think. Be sure to let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you all. Also, if you enjoy Josh Turner and the Paranormal Roundtable podcast, be sure to go ahead and check out his YouTube channel. And if you're a fan of storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural, make sure to go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll catch you guys in the very next video.